I am
cool.
here today with my friend and colleague, Lexi Temkin, who is the lead author on a new study that is especially important to EWG because for years we have published something called the Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce, which helps people figure out which fruits and vegetables have the most pesticides. We have two elements to it. One is called the Dirty Dozen. These are the fruits and vegetables we think because of the amount of pesticides on them and the types of pesticides. One should really be thinking about an organic option to the dirty, if you can find it and afford it, which is always a question. And then we have the Clean 15, which is something we came up with years ago. And I can't remember how long I should know how long we've been publishing the Shopper's Guide.
Since 2004.
Since 2004, yeah. I was in high school. I remember that. And we wanted to make sure, since organic back then especially wasn't as readily available as it is now, and it's still not available enough. We want to be clear that it's unfortunate that we don't have even more access, and that organic isn't more affordable, that there aren't more seasons, that there aren't more growing areas in the country that can produce good organic food on a regular basis. This is all work to be done. But the Clean 15 was really designed for us to be able to say to folks, if you can't find or afford organic, these are options that give you the nutritious benefits of fruits and vegetables, but without the pesticides. And we do tell people it's more important to eat fruits and vegetables, even with the pesticides on them, than not. We've been saying that since 1993, when we published Pesticides in the Diets, Pesticides in Children's Food. At the same time, the National Academy published Pesticides in the Diets of Infants and Children. And we started off by telling people, don't throw away your apple juice like happened during the Alar crisis. But you're not crazy to be concerned about pesticides in your diet. So let's try and work toward a system that has fewer pesticides. So this new paper, which is with yourself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other EWG authors, and Elvira Fleury, who is, she's with...
She's currently working on her Ph.D. at Harvard, but she was a master's student at Brown at the time and was sort of interning with us and really did a lot of the foundational work.
Yeah, fantastic. So thank you, Elvira. Anyway, it's called a cumulative dietary pesticide exposure score based on produce consumption is associated with urinary pesticide biomarkers in a U.S. biomonitoring cohort. Is that nerdy enough for everyone as a title? I hope so.
Yeah, I think so.
Does that passes the threshold. So Lexi, thanks for sitting down and talking about this. I've been following this study as it's gone through all its phases. Very excited that it's now coming out in the International Journal of Hygiene and Environmental Health. It's gone through peer review. It's publishing this week, I think.
Next week, a week from today, actually.
Yeah. All right. Soon.
Yeah.
Tell me. Let's just start with the sort of the big picture. What gave you and your colleagues the idea to kind of take this on? I mean, we published the Shopper's Guide. It gets an enormous amount of attention. It's shared on social media. I have, for all the 20 plus years it's been out there, I have run into people who say, I have the list on my refrigerator. I have it, in my wallet when I grocery shop. We used to produce a tote that had the latest list on it. It changes a little bit year to year. But so we have this Shopper's Guide out there, and it's been it's had a real cultural imprint, I think. We hear a lot from friends in the organic industry that it helps them make the case that organic is a solution set for some people, for some circumstances. We've heard a lot of complaints from organized agriculture that we're demonizing fruits and vegetables with pesticides on them and even discouraging consumption of fruits and vegetables, which hasn't turned out to be the case in our experience and with some of the studies that have been done. It seems like people who eat organic tend to buy more fruits and vegetables, and most people recognize if there's a Clean 15 option, why not go for it? And then organic is so different than it was 24 years ago when it was so hard to find. I used to joke that you had to shop at co-ops or someplace to find organic, and the fruits and vegetables, it wasn't clear looking at them if they'd been harvested or if they escaped, because they were in pretty bad shape, right? And then there was Phil Landrigan's very memorable remark that this is in the early 2000s, late 1990s, a great public health doctor who was the chairman of the National Academy study, Pesticides in the Diets of Infants and Children, that changed the way we think about pesticide exposure. And he said, organic is like private school for food. It's great if you can find it and great if you can afford it, and not everyone can. And back then in the 90s and the early 2000s, before we even had a national organic standard, everyone was concerned that making recommendations to people about produce that boiled down to only organic, if you was going to make it difficult for some people to have a balanced, nutritious diet rich in fruits and vegetables, because the organic options weren't out there. Now you go to grocery stores almost anywhere. It's not every item, of course, but Safeway has a big organic section, Costco, huge organic section, Target, on and on. There's a lot of demand for it. And of course now people are, even President Trump said at one point that he wanted to, in empowering Bobby Kennedy as now the HHS secretary, wanted him to think about pesticide exposure. So here we have this study. And tell me a little bit, with that sort of context, or whatever context was driving you, what gave you the idea to dig in this exact way?
Well, so I think the context or position of where this study fits within the bigger sort of science world around understanding health effects associated with pesticide exposure is kind of the world that this paper lives in. So I'd say broadly, EWG and us as scientists are concerned about exposure to pesticides and potentially adverse health effects. And so in order to study that, you need tools to do that. And that's really what this paper highlights. It's showing that there is a way to estimate dietary pesticide exposure, which just means, eating fruits and vegetables with pesticides on them, and that there's a way to estimate that actually is a good marker of how many pesticides might be found in your body or the pesticide levels in your body. So it's kind of a foundational paper, I would say. It's highlighting a methodology, a tool that this paper helps, validate that tool is trying to do what it is seeking to do.
Yeah.
And so it can be used by other researchers, by us in the future, to really study those core questions about pesticide exposure in the diet and if there are impacts on health.
So I want to get to the parts of it where we've come up with new tools. But let's talk a little bit about the underlying data that forms the foundation of this analysis. It's the Pesticide Data Program, which was developed by USDA after the ALAR crisis, the episode. And we'll put this in the notes somewhere. If anyone wonders what the ALAR episode was all about, you need to look at the original 60 Minutes story with Ed Bradley, where he got the acting administrator of EPA to admit that ALAR was so toxic that if it came to the agency as a new chemical, they wouldn't let it be approved. But since it had already been approved, it was hard for the agency to take it off the market. And so, of course, parents are thinking, I'm not going to give my kids something that wouldn't cut it. So anyway, it's really, that was the origin of a response, a defensive response by the government, which kind of lost control of the debate there during ALAR. Let's test fruits and vegetables that are commonly consumed by kids. And by doing that, we'll be able to reassure the public that we got this under control. We're monitoring the pesticides, and they're all at, if not safe levels, legal levels. None of them are violating the law. We take issue with the levels that are set all the time, and maybe we'll get into that too. So the Pesticide Data Program. Then there's the amazing NHANES data set, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which we have used at EWG in lots of different ways since the 90s with various analyses we've conducted. I think back in the day we even dipped into it a little bit to develop the original Shopper's Guide because we were worried if we limited people to organic, and they couldn't find it, what other nutritional benefits can you get from conventionally grown food that is low in pesticides because of when the pesticides are applied, the types of pesticides, and so forth. Early in the season application doesn't end up so much in the flesh of the fruit. Anyway, so NHANES and the pesticide data program, and I should also add for the pesticide data program, it's rigorous with respect to what they do with the fruits and vegetables before they analyze it for pesticides. They prepare it as if you would in your home, wash it, peel it, whatever. So say a little bit about those two data sets.
Yeah, so I think basically if you think about the question we were trying to answer with this paper, which is kind of basic, it's just, are the pesticides found on fruits and vegetables associated with the amounts of those pesticides in the body based on what you eat? You know, do the pesticides on the fruits and vegetables that I'm consuming actually influence my exposure or levels in my body? And so in order to do that, you need a few different pieces of information, right? You need to know what levels of pesticides are found on fruits and vegetables, and that's exactly what the United States Department of Agriculture Pesticide Data Program does. They monitor for hundreds of different pesticides on fruits and vegetables, and they cover lots of different types. So we used 44 different fruits and vegetables that were primarily collected between 2013 and 2018. And that just has to do with the time period from the NHANES data that we were using. So
and we should as just a coda here, they don't test all fruits and vegetables every year. We don't have this massive surveillance program that is rigorously testing everything you come across in the produce aisle. Some years, some fruits and vegetables are tested for some pesticides, and other years, the group of pesticides tested for might change a little bit.
Yeah, slightly.
And the produce that's tested. And sometimes things are left out that we wish had been left in. I think back in the day, we were early pointing out that glyphosate wasn't examined and that it might not show up in produce anyway, but other foods where you might have this exposure. So there are still gaps, but this is, for fresh fruits and vegetables, this is the best data set around, right?
Yeah, by far. And it's a really strong data set because, you know, even within, for instance, that 5-year window that we were using, you're covering a lot of different fruits and vegetables, and you're getting like thousands, almost 1,000 samples, and each sample is not just one of those fruits and vegetables, it's also a composite. So if you take, you know, a bunch of blueberries at the store or something like that, you'd grab a few pints of them, throw them in a blender, mix it up, and then quantify the pesticide levels. So it's a really robust data set, even though they're, of course, like a pie-in-the-sky world that we would want to see it done every year for every single pesticide.
And we'd want the data in real time.
Yeah.
By the time we get the data from the pesticide data program, we've eaten it.
Yeah, it's a couple years behind.
Yeah.
But that's okay. It's still really good data.
Exactly. Just to go, because I'm not sure people have ever really heard a conversation in any detail about the pesticide data program, its origins and its strengths and weaknesses. And so we've been using that data set for a long time and very familiar with it. So you see that, and then tell me about the NHANES piece.
Yeah, so that second piece of data to sort of answer our question means you need people, right? Like, so you have to know what they're eating, and then you also have to know what levels of pesticides might be found in their body, and that's really where the NHANES data comes into play. They consider there were about 1,837 people in our study, which meant that they had, you know, dietary questionnaire data. They were measured for pesticides. They also had all the other variables that we were including.
So they actually take blood samples, or is it urine?
This was all urinary pesticide concentrations. And that's for a few reasons. One is, depending on the pesticides that you're looking at, they end up in different places in the body. And so urine is usually a really good marker to show that an exposure has already happened, just because of the way when you consume, you know, pesticides or you're exposed to other chemicals, they enter the body, they can travel to different places, but ultimately they're usually processed sort of through the liver and the kidneys and then excreted in urine.
And then you excrete them. You pee them out.
Yeah, or you pee out a metabolite or a biomarker. That's what a lot of these chemicals that were actually monitored for in NHANES are. They're not exactly the same as the chemical that you're ingested because it changes as it travels through your metabolism and through the body. But they're indicators, biomarkers, those are the words that are used to actually show that an exposure took place.
Took place, yeah. It was in your body. And so they collect this data in these like mobile homes, mobile collection units, whatever they call them, that they travel around the country. And so they sit people down. I think they give them a little money to participate. I think that's the case.
I think so.
And so they fill out this, because it's involved. You know, you probably spend a little time doing it. You fill out a questionnaire where you're trying to remember what you ate the last 24 hours in considerable detail. Then they collect your urine. They also do other biomonitoring. They look at your weight. They look at other.
Oh yeah, there's lots of
lot
sort
of other
of physiological examinations, and researchers have published on this data set in many, many different ways.
Yeah,
we truly were
including
just
us.
using
Yeah.
a real subset of the data available just to help answer our question. Yeah.
Okay, so we have the data on pesticides in produce, as robust as we can come up with during that time period. What's the time period again?
Yeah, so
window?
I definitely want to touch on this in that we use the NHANES data from 2015 to 2016 because that was basically the most current and the most comprehensive data for pesticides that they measured that year. So we were able to cover pesticides from 3 different classes for the most part. These are organophosphate insecticides, pyrethroid insecticides, and neonicotinoid insecticides. And so the pesticides that are biomonitored for can change from year to year. And usually that has to do with, for instance, like if newer pesticides are coming on the market. So like neonicotinoids were only started to be monitored in some of that, more recent data. So that's why we picked that year. It might sound kind of old, but it really is, again, that like most comprehensive, most current, robust data set. And so since that was the time period for which people were giving their questionnaire and giving the urinary data, we needed to sort of match the pesticides found on fruits and vegetables to that time period. So that's why we used basically 2 years on either side of the NHANES window to assess pesticides on fruits and vegetables.
So the NHANES part of it, where we're looking in people's urine for the excreted metabolites or pesticides, doesn't exactly match up with all the pesticides that are used, right? So because we just don't measure in people all of the pesticides that we know have been applied on produce. Say a little bit about that gap.
Yeah, so that was sort of one of the major discussion points of the paper, and one of the major ways that we tried to set up this analysis too. So we wanted to basically calculate a dietary pesticide exposure score. That's what we call it in the paper. And what we're doing there is ranking fruits and vegetables based on the pesticides found there, and we can go into sort of the details of that methodology, but then we're sort of weighting the amount of fruits and vegetables that people eat based on that ranking score. And so you can calculate that fruit and vegetable rank based on different subsets of pesticides. And so you could use all the pesticides that are found on fruits and vegetables, which we did in one analysis, which we called our all analysis. But then to actually really answer our question more, clearly and strongly, the pesticides that you're monitoring for in people should be matched
They need to match
to
up.
the pesticides on food. And so if you looked at our all data, or when you were considering all pesticides, that was about 220 different, chemicals, metabolites, or residues that corresponded to 178 unique parent pesticides. So that's, saying 178 pesticides were used to sort of grow the food that we were looking at, or that was tested. But if we just matched the pesticides detected in people to the pesticides detected in food, it only covered about 42. And those are really just 3 classes of insecticides. So
that was a limitation of the data.
It was a limitation of the data, and it's sort of a call to researchers, to NHANES, that we need more biomonitoring, ideally, but also it's a way to show that if we considered all of these pesticides, through our methodology of estimating exposure, it's a reasonable predictor, potentially, of what people are exposed to. Because when we matched them, we saw this strong association between how we estimated pesticide exposure based on the diet and what was actually measured and found in people.
And we should point out, particularly now, since we're sitting here on the day where there's a hearing before the Senate Health Committee where they have brought in the recently fired head of the CDC. This is a function of the CDC, the NHANES study, right? It's CDC professionals, scientists, and technicians and experts who are collecting all of this data and I think, worldwide, it stands out as, I hate to use the term gold standard science.
Yeah.
I think it's not as gold as it used to be, that term. But it's I think the envy of the world in some respects that we have this NHANES data set. Even though there are more things we'd like to add to it. I remember when we petitioned in the early 2000s, I think, to get the agency to include PFAS chemicals in the biomonitoring, because here we had exposed people for decades.
Yeah.
We knew that from internal company documents from 3M and DuPont, but the government itself didn't know to look for these chemicals in people. Now, it turned out that by the time our petition landed at the CDC, they had already decided, for all the reasons that you might imagine, hey, we should be looking at these PFAS chemicals.
Yeah.
But I also remember at the time when we were doing some cord blood monitoring, even the chemical analysis methods that were necessary to find this stuff, in our case, we were looking at umbilical cord blood. We had to pay labs to develop methods. The companies knew how to do it, but they weren't obligated to share it with anybody, not even the CDC. So the CDC had to develop their own methods. So I say this particularly for people who have fallen prey to the notion that the CDC is in the control of corporate interests and everything it does is shaped by those interests. There's great science at the CDC and great scientists with lots of integrity, and they've made huge contributions, and we're using one of those contributions in this study.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it fits within the context, again, of this sort of like overall research. There are other labs that might work to develop a method to measure a pesticide that's not monitored by NHANES, and then perhaps in the future NHANES would include that based off of some of that methodology.
I can think of one, chlormequat.
Yeah, that would be an interesting
Another
one
paper
for sure.
that you published how long? 6 months ago? Was it, or a year ago?
No, it was a year ago. It was in 2024.
Yeah, this was a chemical that hadn't shown up on anyone's radar and was suddenly approved for use in the United States. And your study, which I will link to in the notes here, found it in lots of people and found it in lots of crops, food products that previously we had found glyphosate in. So anyway, and so did we petition the CDC yet to add chlormequat? I can't remember if we did that.
Yeah, we did. We sent them a letter, and I think the other thing that's interesting about that is to actually measure chlormequat, we use sort of a government lab in the United Kingdom, and they had a method developed already to measure it just because it's more prominently used there. So, so like every agency, every government locale has a different reason for why, their priorities are what their priorities. And so, again, they all work together, right, to give you this 100%. Bigger picture of exposure in people, health effects, and I like to think that our paper hopefully adds a little bit in that
That's
space.
why you need independent science to be able to take a look at these things in a way that isn't shaped by the preferences of the manufacturers or the people who utilize the chemicals. I always remind people I can't remember a single instance where a farm group came out and said, yes, it's a good thing we regulated or banned a chemical. Not a single example. And of course, pesticide companies, the same thing. So we have the two data sets now, and we have this idea that we want to find out, okay, if it's in the PDP data, are we going to find it coming out in the urine measured by the NHANES data? And then you invented some new ways of assessing the pesticide exposure that incorporate toxicity, how harmful a given amount of that pesticide based on the science required to get it on the market, which again, often industry-funded studies, but reviewed by EPA. And you came up with a new way of thinking about toxicity that helped us understand that a little bit closer to the reality that while pesticides are allowed on the market one at a time and reviewed one at a time, when you get to that N. Haynes trailer and you pee, it's not just one pesticide coming out at a time. It's we're exposed to a stew of them. So how did you? This is one of the parts of the study I was most excited about because we hadn't ventured to do that in the Dirty Dozen Clean 15. We just talked about levels of and hazard, but now we're talking about it in a little more refined way.
Yeah, so I mean, we used basically 3 different ways of trying to account for basically how much of a pesticide is on the fruits or vegetables. And so we sort of based a lot of it off that initial shopper's guide methodology. We were looking at the presence of pesticides, so the detection frequency, like how many samples of a fruit or vegetable had at least one or more pesticides.
And now when we report that in the shopper's guide, it turns out that most conventional fruits and vegetables have pesticides on them that are found by USDA's labs, right?
Yeah, I mean, and so overall, it's around like 75% of the samples have detectable residues, but it also varies between crop, which is sort of the point of this, showing that different fruits or vegetables have more or less. And if you consider consumption based on that sort of ranking scheme, that might impact or basically is associated with different levels in people. And so we used basically 4 indicators to sort of rank those fruits and vegetables, right? Detection frequency, then the number of different pesticides found, the average concentration.
Because on some of these produce samples where they composite, they'll dump a bunch of blueberries or rhubarb or whatever it might be into a blender so that they're not testing one blueberry, they're testing batches of them. Yeah.
Batches of them. And, you can detect up, I think the average is usually around 5 or something like that, but there's a range there. Sometimes it's only
the average sample has 5 pesticides?
It's at least around 5, I think.
I just want people to know that, these things that are sprayed in farm fields in California and across the country, they end up on the food that is there in the produce aisle. So, and when USDA tests them, they like an average of 4 or 5, whatever pesticides every time they test one of these composite samples.
Yeah. So it's really clear that like mixtures, right, is this question that there's more than one exposure happening at a time. And then
just with like blueberries, much less if you have a fruit salad.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then the 4th was also incorporating this marker of toxicity. And so what's interesting here is that when we ultimately did like our analysis to show, is this method of estimating dietary pesticide exposure actually associated with levels, we tested all of these different ways of putting this indicator together to either see which one might be the most robust or which one was sort of a better predictor or more influential. And so we looked at this, just calculating this ranking without toxicity. And
we've been criticized for not including toxicity over the years, right? Just reporting hazard presence of pesticides in the shopper's guide, and I know we've revised it a little bit in this most recent version. But we've been criticized for that, and I think we've been very open in saying, for years we just looked at, if you're concerned about pesticides, these fruits and vegetables have a lot in them. We didn't do this kind of analysis. And in fact, USDA and EPA don't either. They don't look across multiple pesticides and come up with some sort of summation where they say, your fruit salad is kind of over the edge here or it's getting close. They just look at what's in the strawberries, chemical by chemical. Here's what's in the blueberries. Here's what's in the apples, and so forth. So
and there's a few different reasons why you would consider different options. So like toxicity actually really shouldn't influence exposure, right? And that was sort of the question that we were trying to ask is just, if you have more pesticides in fruits and vegetables, do you have higher amounts of them in your body? And so toxicity actually shouldn't influence that at all, but you might want to consider pesticide toxicity. For instance, if you were then associating it with health effects, maybe you would see a stronger link with whatever health effect you're estimating based on sort of that consideration of how toxic the pesticide is. So that's why, again, this methodology or this paper is sort of like a framework, and depending on what specific research question you're trying to ask in the future, you can use combinations of this. And so what we ended up doing, though, is we had basically an analysis where no toxicity was considered, and then we had an analysis where different indicators of toxicity were considered, because that's also not necessarily sort of an agreed upon
they're more
value. There's reference doses, or ADIs, which are basically values calculated by regulatory agencies that say, this is the amount that if you consume, and it's measured in milligrams of pesticide per kilograms of a person, that if you consume this amount, you shouldn't have any adverse health effects. And so that's one value that you could use, and those values differ between regulatory agencies. We used values.
And over time sometimes too, right?
Exactly. So we used values from the EPA and from the European Food Safety Authority, and we essentially selected the one that was going to be the most health protective. And in
Most
some cases,
stringent, the lowest RFD, for example.
and in some
or
cases,
ADI.
the EPA was more stringent, and in some cases, the European Union was more stringent, but they, weren't the same. And then we tested another version of that toxicity indicator where we used what's called a NOAL, or a no observed adverse effect level, and that is the value at which harm is not, harm doesn't happen in an animal that's dosed with this pesticide. And that's usually the basis for how those human exposure limits, if you want to call them, are set.
And then just to say, this is all the just biological limits. Then there's a different limit that actually regulates the levels of pesticides in food. That's called the tolerance. And that's the legal amount that can be allowed in the food before anyone has to take action, like getting it off the market, or
or recalling fruits or vegetables or something like that, or investigating.
Canceling a pesticide, or
Yeah.
investigating an importer, or whatever it might be. But there's a pretty big gap between reference doses and so forth and tolerances, right? We leave a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah, and it really depends on their tolerances are really there for sort of like how those pesticides are applied, so that none of them are going to be outside of that sort of like legal limit. They're sort of, if you apply this pesticide, how high is that amount going to be? And that's where you'll sort of set the tolerance. And the EPA does evaluate them so that, if every fruit or vegetable was at that tolerance, would you expect to exceed that reference dose? And so that's sort of, they're loosely correlated or connected with one another. But again, that reference dose might not always consider really vulnerable populations. They might not consider the peer-reviewed science that's showing, actually harm occurs at lower doses than that. So there's limitations to them as well.
And a vulnerable population, to go back to the origins of the pesticide data program, one place you start is with little kids. Yeah.
Yeah, that exposure during, development, maybe in pregnancy or early life, there's usually an increased susceptibility to having long impacts later on, health harms later in life. And so that's why we did sort of a few different versions of this to kind of see, are all these methods robust? Can you change this based on, let's say you have new toxicity data? You could replace the value that, we used with newer data. So it's meant to be sort of flexible and valuable to researchers that might use it in the future. And then to consider both of those questions, presence as well as toxicity, because that does have some relevance for human health if you're trying to reduce exposure to, the pesticides that we know the most about that do have some health harms associated with them.
So you have the list of the fruits and vegetables. You have from NHANES the pesticides that show up in urine. Not a perfect match, but you have that subset that matches what's on the produce. And you also have from NHANES how much people ate. You had to try and figure out how much green beans and how much.
That was a fun several months of data analysis.
Yeah, because you looked at processed food too. You didn't just look at fresh, right?
Yeah, so you could sort of simplify your data to just say, people who ate this fruit or vegetable raw. And that's one way to do it. We wanted to be a bit more comprehensive because the way NHANES reports this data is that there's a tremendous amount of ways that people eat food. You could eat broccoli raw. You could eat broccoli in a salad with carrots and lettuce and tomatoes. You could eat it cooked
Frozen
in a stir
entree,
fry.
you
Yeah,
could-
and
yeah.
there's, so we made some.
Well, my son could just not eat any broccoli, however it
Yeah,
occurs, in
there's also
any
that.
form. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we included all those different ways that people eat it and tried to account for, if the broccoli was about 20% of a mixture, we tried to account for that. And the way NHANES reports it is grams consumed. So you have the ability to just sum up the grams of broccoli that somebody ate within
Across
24
all the
hours.
forms they might eat it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Based on their dietary survey.
Yeah, and we converted that to servings, and then basically you multiply that number by whatever rank broccoli has, or whatever sort of pesticide load score, that's what we called it in the paper, has, and then you have this value of relative pesticide exposure from broccoli.
Yeah.
And you add that to the relative pesticide exposure from strawberries or from blueberries and, the different varieties of foods that people ate. And then you get a distribution for those 1,800 or so people of these scores that represent their overall pesticide exposure. Higher scores being more pesticide exposure, lower scores being lower. And you can get there in a few different ways, right? Because of the different foods that you eat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now I think we come to as we're describing it internally, the potato problem. Right. So you're looking at reference doses for different pesticides, and you're looking at food consumption data, as you just described, in as much detail as we can manage. And when you first did the analysis to try and see if there was an association between the new measure you came up with and dietary and levels of the pesticides and metabolites in urine, it didn't exactly line up, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
it was potatoes.
Oh, yeah. So ultimately, we found out potatoes were sort of the fancy way of saying it was attenuating the effect, right? Or it was sort of masking the relationship that we ultimately ended up seeing.
And say
between-
why. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so we first looked at, all the fruits and vegetables and all the pesticides, and we saw that really there was no association, and it didn't matter if you were looking at no hazard indicator or if you were also looking at the toxicity indicators. The three different models we looked at, there was no association. And so that's pretty common in these types of studies. Like you have what you call your base model, your base question, and then you do sort of sensitivity analyses to try and dig a little bit deeper into the data to understand what's going on. And so we're considering 44 different fruits and vegetables, and what we did was basically just drop them out sequentially to see
One at a time?
Exactly,
Yeah.
to see,
Yeah.
so run the analysis without apples, without green beans, without blueberries, without each of the 44 different fruits or vegetables, to see if one of them might be driving the relationship that we're observing or not observing. And so what we saw was that for the most part, nothing really changed, except when you omitted potatoes.
Potatoes.
Yeah, and then you
America's
saw,
number one vegetable.
Yeah, and then you saw this really much stronger association between, where there was no relationship before between our estimate of pesticide exposure and our measurement of pesticide exposure. You actually then saw that those were connected once you kind of dropped potatoes out of the analysis.
And say a little bit more. What were mathematically, what were potatoes doing when they were included in the analysis?
So they basically were just attenuating that relationship. So they were sort of showing that the way we were measuring pesticide exposure from potatoes wasn't associated with our outcome of measuring pesticides in people. And that also didn't matter if we considered all of the pesticides on potatoes. So there is this unique pesticide called chlorprofam, which is on a lot of potatoes and at very high concentrations.
We included it in the Dirty Dozen this year.
Yeah, because it ranks very highly because of that. But when we were considering only those matched pesticides, so NHANES doesn't measure for chlorprofam. So even if we kind of omitted the chlorprofam issue, because there are other pesticides found on potatoes, you still didn't see this association. And we think that could be for a variety of reasons. I think the biggest one is that quantifying how much potatoes people are eating is actually really hard with the data because a lot of people report consuming potatoes, and you consume potatoes in a lot of different ways. So there are potato chips, there is a baked potato with the skin, without the skin, there is, French fries, there's mashed potatoes. So there's just a lot of complexity in understanding pesticide or understanding just potato consumption. And so I think that complexity is more straightforward, or there's just less complexity for some of the other fruits and vegetables. And then also potatoes are pretty much always cooked, and so that can have some influence on actual pesticide levels as well. So it's something that's totally worth investigating, like in other studies and stuff like that. And we actually referenced this in the discussion too, that some of the other papers that we based a lot of our analysis off of that also showed, using PDP data to measure pesticides in foods was associated with exposures in people. They actually didn't have potatoes in their analysis either. So it's possible that it just needs more exploration, more research. And I will say that it's worth understanding how potatoes influence pesticide exposure in people, especially with chlorpyrifam. So it's a point in the discussion, and it's worth future investigation.
And we call it out as something we discovered. What I love about the paper, one of the many things I love about it, is that we are fully transparent about the process we went through, about how things, when we did the sensitivity analysis, we found things that weren't there in the original base analysis, and share all the data. So I just, that's the way EWG rolls. But I was especially proud of it. Now, I should know this, and I don't know this. Does NHANES include food eaten away from home?
Yeah, so it's basically
like
anything
if I went to
that
McDonald's and had their French fries, or
absolutely,
okay,
So you can, it's included, and that's sort of a different indicator. What NHANES will give you is just the sort of food group that was consumed and like the class that it fits into. So they would have French fries, like fast food or something like that. Might be exactly how it's labeled.
So someone could look at away from home food and do this analysis all over again and see if there was anything
you could.
there.
The resolution is like there's so much specificity to the data that you can get into in different pieces that you can analyze for sure. And you could just look at either frozen potatoes or not fried or unfried or something like that. There's a lot of different ways.
Okay, so let's just jump way ahead to where we try and make these things useful in the real world to people. First of all, just to remind everyone, there's lots of pesticides on almost all conventionally grown produce. And secondly, when you're eating these pesticides, you're eating at the end of a regulatory process that never looks at their combination. Never even if they're a whole group of pesticides that have similar modes of action or similar health endpoints, that's not taken into consideration much when they allow these pesticides on the market. It's like every company with every pesticide product on every produce item, they get a singular look as if that's the only exposure that's going to happen. Yeah. So that's, just to remind people, we dug into the data that was built on that assumption, which is not the assumption of the regulatory process. But just to jump ahead, so I'm in the produce aisle or I'm in the grocery store. What do you think this study really? What's the take home, Lex? What do you? You shop.
I do.
All your friends shop, and what do you tell them? What did we learn here that might make people either think differently or feel reaffirmed that they've been worried about pesticides in their food supply?
I think the take home is that diet is a route of exposure to pesticides, and there are a stronger association between more pesticides sort of found in people and consumption of fruits and vegetables that have higher levels. So we did also split the data into just people who consumed sort of like high residue fruits or vegetables, basically the ones that ranked in the top half and the ones that ranked in the lowest half. And we saw that association was stronger for those higher fruits and higher ranked fruits and vegetables compared to the lower ones. So it's basically like diet matters. Diet influences your exposure to pesticides as well as other contaminants, right? This is something that sort of has been, we know it's a common route of exposure. I definitely would say it shouldn't change whether or not you consume a certain fruit or vegetable.
Yeah.
The evidence of fruit and vegetables being healthful in a variety of ways is really strong.
As we've said for decades, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it does sort of just lend fact that it's different routes of exposure and that different fruits or vegetables can contribute to pesticide exposure differently, more or less. And so I think that's, again, trying to offer this helpful advice. Perhaps that's, the ones that have more fruit pesticides on them might be options to consider buying organic when that's accessible. And the ones that are lower are probably not going to increase your exposure as much. And so it's kind of a way to just reduce overall pesticide exposure without buying everything organic, because there have been studies that show, organic consumption does reduce pesticide exposure sort of over and over again, and we know the levels are less. So, eat fruits and vegetables. Consider buying some organic when it's accessible and when it makes sense. But
So if you've been following the Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce for the 20 plus years we've been putting it out, it kind of lines up as pretty good advice based on this analysis, right?
Yeah, I think so. And it sort of mattered it didn't necessarily matter the three different ways that we looked at this analysis. There wasn't enough sort of resolution on if you considered toxicity or if you didn't consider toxicity on it influencing the exposure levels that much. So I think it is general, overall decent advice that the Clean 15 won't increase your pesticide exposure as much as some of the more contaminated fruits or vegetables. And that was always sort of the basis, was that it's an exposure metric.
Yeah.
And that's what our methodology also shows, that you can estimate exposure based on the data coming from the USDA on fruits and vegetables.
Yeah. And we don't make it our official business in the government to figure out what the health endpoint or health concerns might be for the combination of all these pesticides, right? It's just, again, it's one pesticide at a time mostly, right?
Yeah, and again, that's sort of where this paper fits in the research space, is that you can now, this method is sort of, has been shown to be validated is an interesting word to use, but it shows that it is a good exposure metric. It's a reliable predictor of actually measured pesticides in people. So then you can use this if you have, the PDP data, we will always have for the most part. And
we
hope we will always have the PDP data. And if you have dietary questionnaire data, you can start to ask questions about, okay, well, if I have these two pieces of data and I want to know if there's an association with a health outcome in my study population, this is an analysis that you can do. So
as long as we've tested the urine for the pesticides, or done some biomonitoring and actually looked for the pesticides that are used on the produce, but as you said earlier, it's not a perfect matchup. The PDP measures more pesticides than we look for at the NHANES.
Yeah, well, so that's what I was trying to sort of, I guess, communicate, was that our paper shows that it's a good estimate of exposure based on the levels in people. So if you don't have the levels in people, but you have the people,
it's probably in the people.
Yeah, and you can then say, well, I want to estimate exposure and see if it's associated with a health effect. We know that this way of quantifying exposure is a good way to do that.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about this, and some of it's in the process. We don't make public who reviewers were or anything like that, but this goes through a rigorous review process. And as you've described it to me, the reviewers were well schooled in all of these questions and the data sets, and in some cases, had conducted analyses that were, kind of pioneering and similar to what we were doing. So you got a pretty rigorous look. Were there any surprises during the review process, or any moments where the team sort of said, "Ooh, that's a good question. We got to take that on"?
I think they were all really comments that we possibly thought that we addressed or something like that. They were all questions and comments we probably thought we were going to get. And so it was helpful to see that people really understood the questions we were trying to answer, and basically just asked us to, go a little bit deeper, explore that line of thinking a little bit more with the data, maybe try running the analysis this way and see if you get the same thing, or this way and see if you get the same thing. And so we built on the analysis, and ultimately the paper's, a lot stronger and better because of the peer-reviewed process, and we submitted the first version in March. I think we got comments back a few in June, and then we resubmitted in August, and then we got it accepted in September. So that's sort of the timeline and the process.
Yeah. No, and I think, just so people understand, this is not sort of the commonly done in the nonprofit world for lots of different reasons, including the time it takes. And, you have to have scientists of your training and caliber and capability and your colleagues listed on the paper who can do that. And that we're very proud at EWG that we are investing at that level because we want to move the conversation forward, not just on Instagram or TikTok or wherever. We want to move it forward in the scientific community and in the policy regulatory community. And this is what you have to do to move that needle oftentimes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really important to be a part of that research community to understand, what other researchers are doing that are asking similar questions, how your work builds off it, how they can use your work to build off of it, to ultimately all hopefully get closer to a better understanding of whatever that question is. And in this case, it's trying to understand how the mixtures of pesticides found on the fruits and vegetables we eat impact our health. And that's, the overall goal.
Yeah. So you're a mixture of pesticides out there. We know that now for sure. And we know that if you follow the shopper's guide and stay away from the ones that are very high in lots of different pesticides and maybe eat to the clean 15 end of things, if you can't find or afford organic in every case, you're going to reduce your exposure. And there's good reasons to reduce exposure.
Yeah, I mean, and pesticides aren't the only thing we're exposed to. And so I think any opportunity that you can reduce exposure to something is probably going to be an opportunity to potentially reduce risk associated with it. And so again, this is, shouldn't avoid or forgo fruit or vegetable consumption, but it's like a tool within the larger sort of, toolbox, if you will, of overall exposure to different chemicals that can impact our health.
So what about the paper have I not asked you about, or have we skipped over, or what?
I don't know. I mean, that was really, really thorough. We kind of went through all of it. Yeah, I think the biggest thing also that we just mentioned is that gap in what's actually monitored in people and what's actually found in food, and to have the ability then to consider all those pesticides in food, knowing that our method is a good estimator of exposure, can just unlock other research opportunities. So it's exciting.
And let's just review, as it were, gaps. So starting with the PDP, they don't test all produce every year. They spread it out because they don't have the budget to test the whole produce aisle for all the pesticides used on them. Some of the pesticides they test for change. Sometimes they're late bringing on a pesticide they should have brought on. Sometimes it's a pesticide that's just emerged, been approved for use, and so you've maybe missed a few years of exposure. And then there's a couple-year delay between when the results come to the USDA lab when they've completed their analysis and when it comes to market. So by the time you get the PDP data, we've eaten the fruits and vegetables that are analyzed in it. And then on the NHANES side, for all the good work that CDC is doing to get people in these trailers and take urine samples and measure their biometrics in every possible way, there are not as many measurements of pesticide metabolites in people as we know are coming into the pipeline of human consumption via agriculture. So there's a gap there too.
Yeah, there's a gap. And I should say the ones that are prioritized in NHANES are some of the more toxic ones. So it's really important to measure them and understand it.
Yeah, they're smart about that. They're trying to focus on what they think is the biggest risk.
Yeah. And then, but there's, potentially other risks from different pesticides that are emerging. And other people have shown that you can actually measure them in people too. So again, it all fits together.
Again, it's limitations of money, limitations of time, scientific capability, and so forth. And this is no time, at least in this particular area, among many others, this is no time to be cutting back on this expertise and this investment.
They're essential.
Yeah, essential.
Totally.
Well, Lex, thanks so
Yeah.
much. And once again, I'm really excited about this paper, and I think for years to come, it's going to be yielding insights, not just from the paper itself, but from people who maybe adopt some of the methodology, and we'll probably do more with it at EWG. So
Totally.
congratulations to you and to all of our colleagues, Varun, Alexa, Elvira, Dana, Chris, David, and Olga.
Yeah. Well, thanks for reading all 10 pages of it or something like that. I know it's dense.
Multiple times.
Yeah, it's long.
But it's really an important contribution to a long history. Our very first report at EWG was pesticides in children's food, and the very first thing we said, because I wrote the foreword to it, is don't cut back on fruits and vegetables just because of the pesticide risk. It's riskier to not eat fruits and vegetables than it is to consume the pesticides that are in too many of them. We made a lot of progress, but have a long ways to go on that. But thanks. This is a great contribution. Thanks, pal.
Yeah, thank you.